Good evening, and welcome to the final installment of our ARI20 Roundtable Series in celebration of the Asia Research Institute's 20th anniversary. My name is 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧, Deputy Director of the Asia Research Institute and Chair of tonight's event, ARI and Asian Futures in Humanities and Social Sciences Research. It's great to see that so many of you connected to ARI in a variety of ways have tuned in from around the world. Former colleagues and alumni, international board members, research collaborators and partners, as well as current ARI members, cluster associates, and management board members. Welcome. Tonight's event caps a series of anniversary roundtables that have focused on charting ARI's current and future trajectories. First, we'll be hearing from our cluster leaders about our research directions. Then, we will invite them to share their thoughts on the important issues facing the region and the world in a roundtable discussion moderated by Professor Tan Tai Yong. However, before we get into the heart of tonight's session, let's hear some perspectives on ARI and its role in scholarship in this short video.
Established in 2001 at the National University of Singapore, the Asia Research Institute, popularly known as ARI, brings together scholars working across the social sciences and humanities. ARI forms a vital space for Asia-focused, cross-disciplinary research collaboration.
We want to build an exciting place for everybody to come, where you can see whether your theories make sense from an Asian perspective, but not ruling somebody out because they don't know enough about Asia. Singapore's position is extraordinary. That's what makes it important and so exciting.
Over 20 years, ARI has matured into one of the world's foremost research centers on Asia.
For 2 decades, ARI each year has recruited some of the brightest and best talents in humanities and social science working on Asian topics, and many of the most pressing problems of our times are ones that require humanities and social science knowledge, but also require that we as humanities and social science scholars collaborate with people from other disciplines too. Climate change, food security, these are all issues that you need collaborative relations and research with people with other kinds of skills and backgrounds too.
ARI also serves as a key centre that provides opportunities to scholars from Singapore and around the world to visit and interact with leading experts in the field.
ARI is a very open, global, and a diverse institute, diverse in terms of its research topics, disciplines, and also backgrounds of the researchers. But what really made ARI special is its organicity, the sense of being deeply grounded in the region, therefore in the world, in something real. It is special.
What the contribution of ARI in the present and in the future of Asian studies is to really demonstrate that Asia can be an intellectual springboard to theorize more broadly about relevant global issues.
I think ARI is definitely a prime center of that sort of innovative research because of its global perspective and its commitment to taking Asia seriously as a coherent whole. So we can see it in the selection of fellows, in the workshops and seminars and conferences that ARI organizes. ARI does not have an insular view about how Asia can benefit Singapore. It's about how Singapore can work with the rest of Asia.
When we were starting to look more internationally and to develop an international profile, and ARI was very much starting to position itself with a really a grand strategy almost to really build a reputation to be the place to do research on Asia in Asia. It's been, I think, very much not just mirroring the way Asian studies has developed, but actually defining it, I think, in many ways. We now look at trans-regional types of connections. We look at the interactions between communities. We look at the flows, ideas and goods and people and so forth. And ARI's very much been at the heart of that.
ARI's place in the intellectual landscape of Asian studies is so well established now that it's really a time for ARI to be playing a leadership role in various ways. Asia is way too important to be only of interest to Asianists. However you look at the world, whether it be in terms of demography, whether it be in terms of GDP, whether it be in terms of ecological impact, Asia is of global planetary significance.
Terrific. Let's now hear from our research cluster leaders. For this session, each cluster leader will have 4 to 5 minutes to present. So we will first start with Professor 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧, Director of ARI and leader of our Asian Urbanism Cluster.
Hello, everyone. So the research cluster I lead concerns urbanization, urban spaces, and urban lives. The awkward-sounding urbanisms is a deliberate pluralization intended to foreground and to take seriously a diversity of urban forms, trajectories, and human experiences across Asia, and of course involving lots of linkages elsewhere too. Asia's importance to the so-called urban age is often underscored in aggregate terms. By most conventional measures, Asia marks the center of gravity of our urbanizing planet. Not only does that give rise to lots of important regional challenges and issues in its own right, from planning to the politics of inclusion, from housing to heritage, and from economic livelihoods to sustainability, it also means that urban scholarship in and from Asia should be at the forefront of theorizing our urban world today, profoundly unsettling the historical geography of academic urban theory production, in which experiences from Europe and North America have tended to predominate. The plural Asian urbanisms then treats Asia's diversity as a scholarly resource rather than positing some singular Asian experience of urbanization in opposition to Western inherited Western-centered understandings. I resumed cluster leadership in July this year. It's fair to say that we're in a rebuilding phase, not through any fault of my predecessor, Ho Kong Chong. He did an excellent job, but simply because several cluster members recruited by Kong Chong have left in recent months, and there have been delays in onboarding new recruits. The cluster also has a large group of associates. They include 2 broad categories of urbanists. First, those based elsewhere on a US campus who are not appointed into the cluster, but who are within its intellectual orbit. And second, former cluster members who continue association by dint of being involved in ongoing collaborations of various kinds. Overall, the 3 main strands of research around which the Asian Urbanisms Cluster is currently being refashioned are: first, urban heritage and the vernacular city; second, city futures; and third, global urban frontiers. The first of those really flourished under my predecessors, looking at the city of everyday life, its local practices and productions as heritage. Now, wearing my ARI director's hat, I actually like the idea of heritage becoming the focus of a research cluster in its own right, but for the time being, specifically urban heritage is flagged here within the Asian Urbanisms Cluster. The second strand is city futures. Both authority-defined and everyday imaginings of urban futures have been among my research interests for quite some time, and I would say that this topic has assumed even greater significance lately. Responses to COVID-19 intersect in consequential ways with established city planning models, more recent smart and digital city initiatives, and also with climate crisis-related goals, targets, and anxieties. And then thirdly, the global urban frontiers strand relates to burgeoning international work on planetary urbanization, thinking about urbanization in Asia beyond the city as a process that extends into ostensibly extra-urban hinterlands and landscapes, and that isn't even limited to land, to terra firma. There's a burgeoning literature, for example, on oceanic urbanization. And so relatedly, I see part of this third strand as including consideration of urbanization in three-dimensional or volumetric terms, whether that be to do with undersea resources or subterranean infrastructure or high-rise living. So yes, these are my three research strands, the substantive priorities for the cluster moving forward. In line with ARI's KPIs, it's very important to turn some of these aspects into specific fundable research projects. Ongoing hiring decisions are being made partly with that in mind, and some existing cluster members and associates from the slide here are already involved in related research projects that are at various stages of development. Okay, so that's from me. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Our next speaker will be Professor Kenneth Dean, leader of our Religion and Globalization Cluster.
This is the list of our cluster members. Please take a quick look. Just go over some of the ongoing challenges and dynamics of religion and globalization in Asia that we're interested in. Of course, as you can all understand, radical fundamentalism in many religious traditions can and does generate between religious communities. And sadly, many such challenges continue to exist in Southeast and Southeast Asia, and ARI will be watching these. Now, another theme is the collapse of the secularization thesis that argued that under modernization, religion would simply wither away. Whereas the Asian case shows in contrast the remarkable resilience and creativity of plural religious traditions. And now we see many religious groups trying to renegotiate their roles and possibilities in post-secular societies. Another dynamic we're following is the continuing struggle between secular states or secularizing states and religious communities. We see the sacralization of the secular state in the cult of Xi Jinping. And we also see, on the other hand, the rise of religious nationalism in India under Modi. Both lead to very adverse effects on the Muslim minority populations of those countries. And we believe that ARI has a role in documenting the survival and transformations of the great diversity of religious traditions in this area. So what research methods have we developed to document and to explain these dynamics? On the one hand, we're working on GIS mapping of changing distributions of religious communities and ritual traditions across Asia. We're also developing collaborative digital research platforms, such as the Singapore Historical GIS I'll introduce in a moment, Singapore Biographical Databases. These are designed for researchers as well as the public to contribute data and to share information. We're also developing pretty sophisticated online ethnographic methods to deal with the COVID situation. How will global phenomenon shape Asia and religion in Asia? Here, I'll just restrict my comments to the impact of the coronavirus on religious life and institutions. This has obviously been very profound. Many ritual performances have been restricted or canceled, and many religious organizations have had to develop online rituals, hygienic ritual procedures, and move towards highly mediated forms of ritual and community, leaving many individuals with a sense of deep loss and isolation. And we need to follow these trends closely and carefully over the coming years, as the pandemic, sadly, may have many more years to play its role in and impact communities across Asia. Finally, how can we think from Asia and contribute to the humanities and the social sciences? I believe we have a great opportunity to reassess the very definition of religion, which has been uncritically adapted from Western historical experience and imposed on Asian populations. We can challenge the priority given by post-Reformation theories of religion to the importance of doctrine and belief and sincerity in ritual performance, and come up with an alternative theory, analyzing and prioritizing ritual experience within multiple complex ritual traditions. We need to theorize the long history and future possibilities for religious plurality in Asia. And we need to theorize the density and flexibility and speed of circulation within the religious networks stretching across Asia. And this is what we're hoping to do. This is what we're doing currently in our many workshops and seminars and publications. This is our 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧 research blog, has over 100 posts from both academics, religious specialists, and members of religious communities across Asia. I welcome you to look into it, check it out, see if you find something interesting there. Maybe you would like to contribute something to the blog. It's an effort to move beyond academic only access to include many more people in documenting their experience of the pandemic and its effects on religious communities. This is our historical GIS, which shows a very, very dense and rich religious ecology within Singapore, as you can see from this very, very densely packed slide. We're trying to extend this now to Malaysia and Indonesia, hopefully later to Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia. So these are some of the conferences that we've held over the past few years. You can see from the titles the kinds of issues that we're trying to deal with. And we feel this is a very good way of bringing the themes that I just mentioned to the fore through very very focused conferences and workshops. These are some of our publications over the past few years. We're very proud of the work of our cluster members who've been publishing a lot of really interesting work. And on the left-hand side, you can see a number of those books. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the historical documentation that we're still publishing, because there's a great deal of this history that's as yet undocumented and deserves further study. Thank you for this opportunity to present some of the issues of concern to our research cluster.
Thank you, Prof. Dean. Next, we have Prof. 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧 Young and the leader of our Changing Family in Asia cluster.
Good evening, everyone. This is a great pleasure to be here to share with you what the Changing Family in Asia cluster has done in ARI. All right, so Changing Family in Asia cluster, or short for Family Cluster, is one of the oldest cluster in ARI, started in 2003, and the cluster will be closed officially at the end of this year. So at this point, we are at a closing ending phase. So this is more of a reflecting of what we have done. In the past 18 years, we have had two cluster leaders. Professor Gavin Jones it was the funding cluster leader in 2003. In 2010, I took over that role, and until now. The cluster has three clear strategic aims. One is to be a global thought leader on how and why Asian families have been changing. And a lot of those changes are pretty dramatic, and the consequences of those changes. Secondly, we train and mentor the next generation of scholars on family research. And thirdly, to inform the public policies and general public based on our research findings, and through various academic journals, conferences, and also the media of very different forms. Looking back, I think we have accomplished all three aims quite successfully. We do have a lot of family members, cluster members in the past. In fact, we just made a video documenting our alumni and achievement. The video will be available on YouTube soon if you're interested in looking at it. Our approach over the years, at least in the last dozens of years, has been to hold international conferences, 2 international conferences every year, and to make sure that we produce at least 1 and sometimes 2 special issues out of every conference we had held. So these are some of the examples of what kind of topics that we have been focusing on in the last few years. You can see that we've been focusing more on aging issues in recent years, focusing on exploring productive aging concept in Asia, which has not been done before, looking at the long-term care for elderlies in ASEAN +3 countries, and looking at the issues related to retirement and leisure of the elderlies. We've also been interested in how economy has been affecting the family. For example, after the financial crisis, we have looked at how the uncertain labor markets have affected the young children's transition to adulthood, like their labor market jobs, their marriage, fertility, and so on. We've also looked at different changing family forms, like new forms such as the step families, the increasing trend of living alone, and so on. We've looked at migration and marriage trends, and we've looked at children, parents' changing value of children, migrant children, and children left behind, how they're doing, and so on. Over the years, of course, there's a lot of publications, including examples here again, books that document family and population changes in Singapore, economic stress and how that affect human capital and families in Asia, transnational divorces, and journal articles, a lot of them. As I say, in the last 6 years, we have published 15 special issues in different journals. Many of them are leading journals in the field, such as Journal of Marriage and Family, Family Issues, Social Science Medicine, GEMS, Demographic Research, and so on different topics here you can see. And again, Journal of Gerontology, Aging and Health. These are all quite visible and leading journals in the field. And we have done a lot of work on youth and transition to adulthood as well. So over the years, our alumni have spread all over almost all different continents, certainly United States, Europe, Australia, and many countries in Asia, definitely in Singapore as well. They're in key positions in NTU and US and SUSS and so on. So we're very proud of their accomplishment and what our cluster has done in ARI in the last 18 years. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Young, who will be followed by Associate Professor 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧, leader of our Science, Technology, and Society cluster.
Thank you, Maitri. Science, Technology, and Society, or STS, is a very widespread interdisciplinary project with over 170 research and teaching centers around the world. Our cluster is the principal STS research unit in Singapore and arguably in Asia, although we have many partners in this region and in other Singapore universities. As the phrase suggests, we study the social and cultural dimensions of science and technology, but around themes tailored to our region of the world. Medicines have been central to us because science in Singapore is largely revolved around health, and we've not neglected Asian indigenous medicines, which are major industries in their own right. Technologies are also a natural focus, given that Asia is on the cutting edge of adopting new ones to social purposes. The environment is an increasing specialty of ours, as it is in the other ARI clusters, and we work across clusters in all these areas. And an even more recent interest is in what I'll call non-humans, which can refer both to the red panda hiding in the forest in this slide, as well as the robot dog out for a walk. Many of our projects combine 2 or more of these themes, sometimes all 4. A good example is our longest standing initiative, a recurring consultancy with the International Atomic Energy Agency around Japanese recovery efforts from the Fukushima disaster. We've attended or co-organized 18 conferences on this theme in the last decade, one that just ended yesterday, and 2 of which were held here in Singapore. This project involves public health communication, technological failures and successes, environmental degradation and restoration, and even non-humans, such as the irradiated boar in the lower left-hand corner, who are rewilding the area evacuated by human beings. This is also one project where we've made a significant ongoing contribution to global policy. We've always been grant active, as have the other clusters. Our current flagship grant-funded project is Heat in Urban Asia, Past, Present, and Future. The poster on the left is from our most recent international conference, and the images on the right are from our soon-to-be-launched interactive website. A lot of scholars around the world are studying the urban heat island effect, as we are, but we're the only research group looking at it from an Asian regional perspective, and also historicizing. After all, parts of Asia have been living with extreme heat for centuries, and not necessarily in the form of waves, but chronically. This is also our first foray into digital humanities, Our website is pitched toward informing a general educated public and not just specialists. As for future projects, the STS cluster is a partner in a pending Tier 3 grant application organized by NTU's Earth Observatory called INVEST. Singapore is already a center of expertise on earthquakes, volcanoes, and geologic matters generally. But this project, if funded, will take that research to a whole new level. Our role will be investigating the historical and long-term cultural effects of seismicity and volcanism in the so-called Ring of Fire, which helps define Southeast Asia. But we'll also be working with the scientists in better mapping geological hazards using historical evidence. Like the Fukushima initiative, and to a lesser extent the heat one, the INVEST project shows our commitment to productive teamwork with those in scientific disciplines, and also demonstrates their belief that the addition of humanities and social science scholars to their projects give them additional depth and extend their influence. Likewise, we have a track record of enrolling scientists into our own humanities projects. This is another pending grant initiative in which we're collaborating with zoologists and biologists around the common concern of species extinction. Loopholes often exist in wildlife trade regulations for animals used in traditional medicines. But who's to determine which animals and which uses were traditional, if not historians and anthropologists? By creating a database with sources from pharmacopoeia to trade statistics, we mean to paint a comprehensive historical picture of medicinal animal usage in Asia. And in so doing, we hope to say something important about the sustainable and ethical use of animal medicines in a period of zoonotic disease and mass extinction. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. Our next speaker will be Professor Naoko Shimazu, leader of our Inter-Asia Engagements Cluster.
Okay, thanks, Maitri. So my name is Naoko Shimazu, and I'm a global historian of Asia. And I became the research cluster leader of the Inter-Asia Engagements Cluster. We call it IAE for short, since July of this year. So I'm very new to this job. And so in some sense, I'm kind of going to use this opportunity to outline a bit of my vision for this cluster. And I also am appointed at Yale NAS College as a professor of history there. Okay, so this is our cluster. It's quite a big cluster with quite a lot of active members. And I just want to very quickly kind of highlight some of the cluster members. Stefan Hübner has been at ARI since 2016, and he's trained as a historian of modern Japan, but currently is working on very kind of wacky, interesting projects on the world's oceans, which I'll tell you a bit about later. And then Michelle Miller is also a very much an old hand at ARI. And she is a senior research fellow, and she works on the political geographies of environmental governance and urban change, and has worked extensively on Indonesia and on the Mekong region in particular. And then with the postdocs, we have Gerard McCarthy, who is a political scientist and interested in working on the politics of inequality, mostly in Myanmar and Sri Lanka. And then we have Yang Yang, who's a human geographer and works on the Hui Muslims in China and their connections with non-Chinese Muslims in Southeast Asia, as well as with the Middle East. And then last but not least, Jorge Bayona, who just joined as postdoctoral associate in October, and he's a trans-Pacific historian connecting Peru with the Philippines in the 1920s and 30s through the networks and activities of revolutionaries. And he is currently still trans-Pacifically located in Lima, and will hopefully join us soon in Singapore. Now we have two visiting research fellows. One is a senior fellow, Sun Shifang, who is a professor of international relations from Tsinghua University, and he is working on the China's foreign policy in Asia, in East Asia in particular. And then Dr. Chun Hui Ko, who is an Ottoman specialist, currently visiting us from the University of California, Los Angeles. we've all been kind of asked to think about what our cluster means. And so what do we mean by Inter-Asia? So the current name dates back to 2016 to Professor Jonathan Rigg, who was then the director of ARI. And so the cluster, the way I see it anyway, as a new cluster leader, is that it seeks to problematize the way we think about Asia and the potential of anchoring Asia at the center of many global developments in the line of this Global Asia framework. Now, what is perhaps notable is that it attempts to emphasize Asia's connections transregionally, rather than the more traditional approach of looking at Asia or its parts as regionally exclusive units of study. So to this end, Professor N. Seng Ho, who has been the member as the distinguished Mohammed Alagil Chair in our cluster, his program called the Mohammed Alagil Arabia Asia program has been an important catalyst in embracing the Indian Ocean more wholeheartedly in our cluster as a way of accessing the Middle East from this part of Asia in Southeast Asia. So one of the questions we ask is whether Asian experiences can offer basis for theorizations at a more general level. And this has been mentioned by Director 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗧, in particular in his speech. But what we are going to do as a cluster is that we are planning a kind of brainstorming session, an intra-cluster brainstorming session, in order to revisit this definition of concern and how we as cluster members practice it in our research. So there's this theory and practice, and that connection we find to be, we think it to be a very important thing to think about as we do our research. Now, if you look at this, there's that thing called the sandpit of ideas. So my priority is really to foster experimental thinking in interdisciplinary research. And the IA cluster is unusual in that it does not have a thematic boundary. And instead, it is about not having boundaries of any kind and enabling colleagues to think beyond their boxes, beyond their knowledge and methodology, to explore new ideas in research. And I know this is ambitious with quite a bit of blue sky thinking involved, but I strongly believe that we need to have an experimental space to try out new ideas and to try out new collaborations with scholars from different disciplines. And of course, this doesn't always lead to success, but failures are very important in learning about how to think about the next phase and next new ideas coming up in the horizon as a result of our experiences. So just as an indication, so we have the current themes, and we actually have quite a lot of things going on, and it's been quite a problem trying to think of definitive themes, but we do have at least 4. And one is the environmental issues, and you will see why this is a prominent theme in our cluster. And also another thing is the infrastructures of connection and integration, which we are hoping to expand and strengthen in the coming years. And the third one is COVID-19 and its implications. And I think we as cluster, as well as all the other clusters, I'm sure, feel the importance of being able to respond to current crisis in Asia as well as in the world. And so we have started a small project, pilot project, but we think that this is going to lead to further projects in the years to come. And then the fourth one is new approaches to diplomacy and cultural heritage, which is connected to that. Now, as an indication of this kind of variedness of our research themes and methodologies, we organized 2 roundtables from our cluster for this ARI20 20th Anniversary Series. And Professor Isaac Curlow, who is a renowned documentary filmmaker, he organized a panel around his documentary feature film called The Tsunami of New Dreams, and had a kind of discussion basically reflecting on the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, focusing on the 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧 experience. And this actually ties in very nicely with the founding director of ARI, Professor Tony Ree's interests in 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧 as well. And then we had a second panel organized by Stefan Hübner on Oceanic Asia. And this was essentially a global history type panel, but we had colleagues from Harvard, Osaka, 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗧, Sofia, and Cambridge universities to contribute to this panel. And so clearly oceanic studies is emerging as an exciting subfield in the environmental theme. Now, with the infrastructure theme, James Sidaway, who's a geographer in the Department of Geography at NUS, he leads the Max Weber Foundation Research Group on borders, mobility, and new infrastructures, and with a particular focus on cross-border infrastructures in Southeast Asia and beyond. And the most recent project to come out of this was on the BRI as a method. And so this ties in with our ambitions to think, use Asia as a sort of foundations on which we can theorize on some of the important issues facing us. So these are the four kind of projects that have been funded to varying degrees. The largest project we have at the moment is TECSI, Transboundary Environmental Commons of Southeast Asia. And this is led by Professor David Taylor of the Geography Department and has Michelle Miller, Tong An Tran, and Rini Astuni. And then the second one is linking the digital humanities to biodiversity history in Singapore and Southeast Asia. And Anthony Medrano and Stefan Hübner are particularly interested in developing the digital humanities aspect of this kind of research. And thirdly, archiving the underclasses, knowledge, law, and everyday agency in modern Southeast Asia. This is an archive project, which is going to come, part of it is going to be an archive project, and it promises very interesting outcomes. And then lastly, it's the one on COVID, called Living with COVID-19 in Southeast Asia. Thanks, Maitri.
Thanks very much, Naoko. Our next speaker will be Associate Professor Jamie Davidson, a leader of our Identities cluster.
Thank you, Maitri. Good evening, everyone. So I am the cluster leader of the Identities cluster. It is among the newer clusters. We have two main cluster members, postdoctoral fellows, Dr. Graham Wan-Hao and Dr. Patrick Quinton Brown. I will discuss some of their research shortly, and a host of cluster associates that in the interest of time, I will not go over, name them individually. So what is the cluster all about? Identities cluster is principally devoted to advancing conceptual, theoretical, and methodological approaches to identities in Asia. These include national, ethnic, religious, racial, sexual, gender, political, generational, and others. The cluster is multidisciplinary in scope and is concerned with how identities are produced, where they come from, how they are reproduced and maintained, the processes and mechanisms by which they change or evolve over time and space, and what kinds of effects they produce. Finally, the cluster is also interested in investigating identity configurations across various scales and entities, from individuals and villages to organizations, nation states, and even relations among states. I think what nicely encapsulates what the cluster is all about is by the holding of one of the ARI20 seminars past September. It was called Identity Research in Asia, Past, Present, and Future Directions. It was very successful. We had 130 Zoom participants. We invited three prominent scholars, Sarupa Roy from Groningen University, Peter Jackson from ANU, and Ayn Ong from Western Sydney University. They presented their thoughts on their own personal and professional histories and identities as they relate to the body of identities research in their respective fields. What are some of the key strands of research in our cluster? Well, I want to present this to you by highlighting two research projects in particular. Both of them by our postdoctoral fellows. The first one is Patrick's A main component of Patrick's research is located at the nexus of identities in Asia and international relations, or IR, and starts with the Bandung, or Asian African Conference of 1955. Though governments gathered represented nations of different sizes, ethnicities, religions, languages, and indeed political bloc alignments, there were certain principles upon which they could all agree. Patrick's research explores what these principles upon which they could all agree were, and how exactly do they relate to the identities that became associated with the Third World, or later the Global South. More broadly, Patrick asks, how have particular Asian identities been built around the norms and practices of international law and international society? And how have those identities evolved and changed, with what effects on the conducts of states? Patrick is exploring such questions in a nearly completed book manuscript. More specifically, it explores the ways in which states people have reordered intervention and non-intervention since the middle of the 20th century. It is concerned primarily with non-Western constellations of Western-dominated order, and provides a conceptual roadmap for understanding dilemmas of intervention and non-intervention today, and the reconstruction of intervention and the globalization of the society of states. The second project I'd like to highlight is by our other postdoctoral fellow, Graham. Graham's research focuses on everyday self-expressions of the Chinese Hui minority. Graham publishes in the fields of narrative study, material culture, and ethnology. The working title of his book project is Around the Dead Men We Gather, Negotiating Muslimness in China Through Death-Related Folklore. A major research question asked in the book is on culturally dense and socially intense occasions. How do people living on ethnic and cultural margins identify and express themselves? Recognizing the marginal nature of Hui people, the manuscript instantiates the ethnic and personal identification processes of the Hui in death lore, in a village where Hui and Han cultures, Islam, and vernacular beliefs coexist and converge, to engage with previously conducted research on the diversity of ethnic groups in China in particular, and minority studies in general. The theoretical bent or basis is that a group of people, ethnic included, only emerges from ephemeral and contingent performances. Similarly, a group, be it an ethnic minority, a community, a neighborhood, or a family, does not only emerge, but also disappears and separates through performances. So thank you very much. That was just a brief snapshot of some of the research that is currently being undertaken in the cluster. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Our final presentation for this section will be Professor Brenda Yeo, leader of our Asian Migration Cluster.
Good afternoon or good morning to people out there. I'm just trying to imagine ARI's diaspora, the very rich and wonderful diaspora spread across the world, coming together in this celebratory moment. But it's a bit challenging because all I see is a screen. So I'm hoping that if I stare hard enough at the screen, I will be able to send happy vibes to everyone and draw you in this celebratory moment. What I wanted to, in a sense, present is to showcase the Asian Migration Cluster as one of the key centers for migration research in Asia that focuses explicitly on understanding migrations, mobilities, and interconnectivities within and beyond Asia. There are many migration centers in the world, but I think the ARI Asian Migration Cluster is quite unique in its focus on Asia. The cluster draws energy from our cluster members and associates that you see on the list here, both past and present. And I apologize that the slide only reflects current membership, but the point I want to underscore is that the cluster pulls together synergies from cluster members with different expertise into research teams, and that is, in a sense, the basis of how the cluster works. We organize our work around four main themes: and members work in cross-cutting ways in developing workshops, projects, conferences, and so forth under these themes. Our first theme is on transnational migration and cities. And here we seek to understand the complex linkages between globalization and transnational mobility as they intersect in Asian cities, producing cities of diversity. This has, of course, been turned on its head by the pandemic, and we are also continuing work that looks at how transnational migrants have been immobilized and the effects on city spaces as well. We normally work through a series of workshops organized around the themes in order to try to explore and bring new knowledges together, in this case on material processes and the discourses of global change and migration in cities. So here are some of our workshops, including one in 2017 on migrants in global cities across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, where we tried to understand how global city making happens and how, in the sense that produces migration diversity, as well as the possibility of cosmopolitan urbanites. The workshop in 2019 looks at migrant-led diversification, and here the interest is in how migrant groups are differentially included in a city of migration. We don't just focus on labor migration, but we've also worked on marriage migration, and this is one workshop that explores the gendered ideas of citizenship and the nexus between marriage, migration, family, and citizenship. On to our next theme, which is a long-standing one. Here we're interested in aspirations, migration, and development, focusing on the developmental impact of migration in sending communities and the cost and risk of migration for the poor. So what's a mainstay in the cluster is this focus on sending communities as opposed to the more plentiful work, which focuses on whole societies. Our long-standing longitudinal project is called 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧, Child Health and Migrant Parents in Southeast Asia. And this investigates the long-term impact of parental migration on the health and well-being of children. We have completed 2 waves of data collection in the Philippines and Indonesia under 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧. And we were actually hoping to begin the 3rd wave when the pandemic struck, and our plans then have to be, in a sense, postponed. So, like the first theme, we also organize a series of workshops around the idea of aspirations and migration and development, but we also push this out in terms of special issues and publications in journals and books, and I've just listed some of these here to show the range of publications in geography journals, anthropology journals, youth journals, and migration journals. Okay, the 3rd theme is on migration industry and migration infrastructure. Here we are not so much focused on the migrants themselves, like in the earlier 2 themes, but we're interested in the facilitators of migration. So the focus is on the role of migration brokerage and migration infrastructure in organizing, channeling, and facilitating mobilities, and in that sense also creating immobilities. Just draw one example of this theme, and this can be found in some projects that we organized under the Migrating Out of Poverty Research Consortium that lasted 7 years, ended a few years ago. And for this theme on the migration industry, we focused research on low-wage migrant workers, domestic workers, basically, and looked at their ability to gain social and economic mobility for themselves and their families vis-a-vis the workings of the migration industry. And here I want to, in a sense, highlight that apart from workshops and research projects and publications, We are also interested in pushing out outreach events and different ways of reaching the public with our research findings, as seen here in short films that the team has created. Syria is about a returning Indonesian domestic worker, and her dreams of setting up a library in her village is very short, so do take a look if you're interested. And we also accompany this with Asia Trend public outreach events. The one shown here has to do with exploring how migrant domestic workers and employment agents factor in Singapore's long-term care provision for families. Moving on then to my final theme, right? And here, the focus here is on transnational migration and aging. And under this particular theme, we are interested in the way that care is provision for older adults, but also how care is provided by older adults. So the two faces of the care network. And this we do in the context of care circulations and rapid population aging. And featured under here is the TRACE project on transnational relations, aging, and care ethics. And since my time is up, I will just mention that we are very interested in the cluster to develop new methodologies for researching migration. And featured here is the endeavor to use qualitative GIS in the TRACE project. And the results has been quite promising, as seen in this particular article that was published just this year. Yeah, so I think with that, I end the presentation and pass this back to our chair.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yeo, and thank you everyone for sharing with us the exciting research that's being pursued at ARI. We now shift to our second session, our roundtable discussion about the future of Asia, moderated by Professor Tan Tai Yong, Chairman of ARI's International Advisory Board. Prof. Tan, over to you, please.
Thank you, Maitri. Hello, everyone. My name is Tan Tai Yong, and I'm the newly appointed chair of ARI's International Advisory Board. It's my pleasure to moderate the panel discussion following the very informative presentation by 7 cluster leaders. I thank them for sharing very useful information on the focus of their work and the issues they are all addressing. Maybe I should start by posing a general question to whoever from the sort of 7 cluster leaders would like to answer, and that's basically to ask, what do you see are the key existing and emerging Asia-centered issues that ARI needs to engage through its cluster? I know many of you have already mentioned themes like environmental challenges, pandemics, changing structures, social structures, but what do you see are some of the key emerging themes that you think ARI should be paying attention to? Any takers? Maybe I'll start with the newest, Jamie.
Thanks, Prof. Tan. Yeah, obviously, I think promote our cluster. I think that people need to take identity more seriously, right? Alongside the kind of old, more traditional, maybe some social sciences interests, right? Ideologies, institutions. I think if you've paid any attention to what's been developing in Singapore, but also other countries in the region, the past year, 6 months or so, is this percolation of identity politics. I think some people for many years have kind of wished this away and hoping these types of energies or expressions could be diffused through different organizations, different interests, different groups. But it seems to be something that seemingly was kind of, for some people was always there, for some people didn't really want to pay it attention. And I think the more you don't pay it attention, the higher the cost will be when you do pay the proper attention. And it's just something that from ordinary people to elites to state, policymakers are really going to have to grapple with. Just gets accentuated in the era of inequality and COVID. People have to become more comfortable talking about it in the public realm in ways that it's hard to talk about it productively and not to offend. But it's just something that scrubbing it from public view, I think, will eventually have some type of blowback or backlash that people, I think, wisely could prevent with some forethought and some prescription. So anyway, yeah, again, to promote the cluster, the identities paradigm, particularly in Asia, isn't going anywhere and it's going to be with us for a very long time.
Thank you, Jamie. Greg, maybe I'll turn to you. Do you have any thoughts on technology, society, and the very wide-ranging work that your cluster does in terms of addressing these themes?
Yeah, it's very wide-ranging. Science and technology, the STEM disciplines are very large, so we have to be selective in what we choose. And I guess we've gravitated increasingly toward environmental issues because the global scientific community is gravitating toward those because they're a crisis. And so we're very aware of that crisis. I'm very aware of living in the middle of a rainforest, which gives us a particular perspective in Southeast Asia on biodiversity issues. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. A lot of science these days is crisis-related science. And so I think that wasn't how we started out. We started out 10 years ago just looking at Biopolis down the road and looking at simply health issues and medical issues. But now increasingly, our focus is, we're still looking at health and medical issues, but within the context of a larger environmental crisis.
Any others would like to? Brenda, I kind of see you moving ahead. So
well,
you have a comment?
Well, I mean, I was just responding to Greg's sense of crisis. I mean, and so whilst there, of course, many long-standing Asia-centered issues that will continue to occupy the attention of all the clusters here, I thought, thinking about crisis, that maybe we should think about the 3 C's that will deserve priority on research agendas. And I don't know whether we're thinking about the same thing, but my 3 C's, to make it simple, is COVID, climate, and China. So, so for COVID, I think it's quite clear that it's major implications for the migration cluster, it's major implications on migration and mobility, because you have the speeded up kind of transnational mobility in the age of globalization, but this has stalled. Border crossings has become very difficult, dangerous, and even discriminatory in pandemic times. And we need to deal with crucial questions, very fundamental questions, like whether we are seeing the end of the age of migration as we know it. So of course we think not, because the Asian migration cluster has a rationale for continuing. And similarly with the climate emergency, I mean, that's another very pressing issue that I don't think any of the clusters can avoid, that will command attention. And already there's been calls for more ambitious and urgent climate change mitigation kind of issues. And for the migration cluster, this is linked to whether this will spur greater irregular and undocumented and precarious migrations, and therefore the need to think about the migration regime and the provision of this decent work for migrants in order to avoid that kind of crisis that unfolds from another crisis. And China, I'll throw that in because that's an important piece of the geopolitical jigsaw puzzle. China-Southeast Asia relations, very important. In the migration cluster, we are hosting a new project called 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧, which is Belt and Road Initiative, Belt and Road and International Student Mobilities. So the idea here is not so much to focus on the infrastructural aspects of BRI, but to think about the emerging knowledge spaces and circulation and the possibility of a new Asian regionalism. So those are my 3 C's in response to Greg's crisis.
Thanks, Brenda. Building on what you and Greg have said, and that's the question to just come in, whether there are sort of cross-cutting themes that could facilitate inter-cluster collaboration, and what are the possibilities? Are there examples of this happening, and are there events that one could look forward to where clusters come together to address these very big issues that many of you are addressing in common? Greg, I see your hand, and I see Ken also, and then I'll go. Greg, you go first.
Yeah, well, a very good example of that is our long-standing work on disasters in the region. And we put together, our cluster and Asian urbanisms put together a Tier 2 grant application, co-written and a few years ago. It's just finished, but it was on disaster in Southeast Asia, which we'd done previous work on and we're still doing work on. And but the bigger thing, I mean, we've done these cross cluster collaborations and research, but I'm more impressed by the fact that, as Brenda said, a lot of the themes that used to be within one cluster are now extending across all the clusters. The environment is extending across, all the clusters. And so there's a lot more opportunity, I think, in the next few years for the clusters to work together than there ever has been.
Ken?
Yes, thank you. We've worked very closely with the migration cluster on the role of religion in migration in Asia, as well as with Asian urbanisms on the impact of urban space on ritual and religious community. And we see a lot of crossovers with many of the clusters. In relation to the BRI, the example I'd like to raise is a Southeast Asian initiative to not just Yidai Yilu, but Yihai Yimiao, one temple, one ocean, one temple. It's a great slogan suggesting that Southeast Asian earth god temples can unify horizontally across the region and create their own networks and their own responses to kind of top-down initiatives from China or from local governments, indicating that a lot of these religious communities have a great deal of autonomy within their own respective communities and polities. So yeah, we see all kinds of possibilities for interaction across the clusters. In terms of the science and technology cluster, we've recently tried to develop ecological maps for Singapore with Stephen Hoopner's help, and he's in the IEA cluster. So all these researchers work across the different regions to develop things. And that links really up to what Tim mentioned about heritage and how heritage is such an important part of the study of religion and community, and cultural heritage is such an important theme for ARI to continue to research across all these clusters.
Thank you, Ken. Naoko?
Yeah, okay, so this is actually quite a good point to jump in because of what Ken has just said about the importance of cultural heritage. And because cultural heritage can be actually studied from so many different angles. And I think in our cluster, there is growing interest in looking at cultural heritage as an infrastructural project, which is not just about cultural policy or the conservation of World Heritage sites and what have you, but that they become actually economic and political issues within the region because of the prominence of some of these cultural heritage projects throughout Southeast Asia. So I think that's a very interesting and promising new lead that's on the existing kind of framework that we already have. And in terms of cross-fertilization amongst the clusters, I think it's going to be more and more, I think, moving that way, and mainly because of what Brenda's mentioned about the 3 C's. in IE, obviously, we also cover the 3 Cs in exactly the way that you say, but from a slightly different angle. Like, for example, if all being well, we might be able to have a joint kind of appointments in future with clusters of the new hires and so on. So I see all kind of positive signs about increased collaboration between the clusters.
Thank you. Tim, you have a comment?
Yes, thanks, Tai Yong. Actually, also just stimulated by the comments that Naoko just made. Another term, at least, which seems to circulate across many clusters at the moment and is reflective of wider intellectual trends, is infrastructure. Whether this is material infrastructure, which is familiar to urbanists like me, migration infrastructure, which I know Brenda and some of her collaborators have written about. Obviously, infrastructures of connectivity, even the kind of what enables the imagination of connected temples can be understood as a form of infrastructure too. So I raise that partly as a topic in its own right, but also because I think, like climate, which we've already talked about, I think there are important questions for us here about, should we be identifying topics which have an appeal because they are cross-cluster, or should we be trying to identify new topics which can be new clusters in their own right? And I think that's an interesting dilemma. Well, maybe it's my dilemma as director, but it's one I think is open for discussion here as well. So to what extent are these topics that we're seeing, that we're all engaging with in different ways, signs that they should be institutionally framed as cross-cluster topics, or to what extent can new topics be the focus of novel new cluster formations in their own right?
Thank you, Tim. Jean, I'm going to ask you to come on and share your views as well. And also to address this question has just come in. Someone is quite saddened by the knowledge that your cluster is going to close, and asking whether even with the sort of changes that are happening to the cluster, will there be further research in ARI on family in some other forms, or being undertaken by some other cluster? Jean, your views, please.
Yes, Tai Yong, thank you, and thank you. Appreciate the comment for the work that we have done in the family cluster. Yes, for sure, we will continue to do work on family in Asia. This is a key critical point, in fact, since there's a lot of family changes, critical family changes, and population changes that are happening that is affecting everyone's lives. Your topic you mentioned about fatherhood, because of the COVID-19, a lot of the gender roles we're expecting and hoping to change. The role of how we organize work and family is something that we will continue to look at. We've been studying how paternity leave affect fatherhood roles and how that affect father-child and family relationship and so on. Other important topics such as, again, coming back to COVID-19, that's probably the most timely topic now, and that cross-cuts every clusters too, definitely family cluster. So, have the economic impact of the family, how inequality is expected to increase and affect women, children's lives. Those are very, very important topics that we are continuing to research. Other topics like the changing population dynamics. Certainly aging is something that we will continue to focus a lot on, and we have been doing a lot, but a lot of societies are losing population decline, including Singapore. So this population decline, and more people are choosing to have no children at all, not getting married, and living alone. These are themes that we have already started before COVID-19. but these are topics that are actually becoming a lot more important because of COVID-19. And we've collected a lot of data now before COVID-19 and during COVID-19 that will definitely continue to explore and study this issue and publishing them. And I look forward to continue to collaborate with our ARI colleagues in all kinds of different topics. So do not despair. Definitely we'll continue to work on these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. I have two questions that are connected, and we're going to try to put them together. One is about understanding Asia on its own terms, despite its differences. How all clusters are trying to develop some concept of Asia and the distinctiveness of Asia. Now, the question is, of course, how do you push back in a process of doing this whole idea of provincializing Asia from European Western perspectives? And then linked to that is this question of a global Asia, the concept of a global Asia, and how do clusters think about this whole concept. So it's about doing things that are and yet drawing it so that you offer knowledge that goes beyond Asia, that has global kind of implications and distinctiveness. Anybody like to address those? First, what's distinctive about Asia and the theories, your research, and then think of it as kind of a globalize this Asian understanding. Ken, I see your hand.
Yeah. I think there's a great deal to be gained by looking at Asian historical experience, especially the long history of intercultural, interreligious interactions, hybrid cultural formations, and plurality of religious traditions, and attempting to push back against the very Western-oriented definitions of religion that have impacted societies here through imperialism and colonial experience and the transfer of categories into Asia and into policy in Asia. So I think we have a tremendous opportunity. In terms of how these concepts can turn into a global Asia, we can also see many of these formations, lineages, temple networks extending into even Asian Christianities, extending into Europe and around the world, and creating new transformations in the ecologies of those religious ecologies of those areas. So there's a great deal of very interesting theoretical and empirical work that can be done in transforming our reliance on earlier paradigms.
Any other takers? Other panelists?
I was just going to add that I think it does require collaborations across the different clusters in order to contribute to, theorizing from the South, when the South is often used just as a testing ground for theories based on the experiences of the North. So pushing back against this will, I think, require not just directing more resources and more research to Asia as the so-called non-West, but it has to go beyond that. So it needs to, in a sense, think of Asia having its own identity and context, whether this is a social, cultural, political kind of context, and we need to recover conceptual insights that respect human experience as lived in Asia. And that kind of endeavor would be kind of important. So just to illustrate it, migration research, traditional migration research is very focused on concepts of assimilation and acculturation and integration, because it's basically based on permanent migration. But we know in Asia, the primary mode of migration is temporary migration, and where the paradigms of assimilation and integration do not apply. So it's important to look at other ways of understanding migration that's in a sense true to Asia. And here the cluster has been working on issues to do with enforced transience, permanent temporariness, in order to reflect the precarious conditions under which migrant workers in many Asian cities are invited to labor but not to stay. So that's just one example how, in a sense, we cannot just apply the Western based paradigms to this region, but to, in a sense, work together to push back, as I think Ashwari mentions.
Other thoughts? Jamie, I think you have you want to speak, right, Jamie? Yeah, go ahead.
So if I understand the conversation, I'm going to comment on operationalizing global Asia and then kind of pushing back on Western theorization. So, from an identities perspective, I don't know if I could, off the top of my head, give you a satisfactory definition of global Asia, but to me, I could think of a few examples off the top of my head that encapsulate what global Asia could mean, right? Study of identity, particularly, I don't mean to step on Prof. Dean's toes, but on religion, right? You look at something as old as like Catholicism in the Philippines, from something as new as the rise of megachurches in Singapore. I mean, those are wonderful examples of global Asia, right? Neither of them, in some respects, have origins in Asia, but they have incredible impact on Asia. They indigenize in certain ways, but they continue to get fueled and changed, not just because of relations domestically, but the relations globally, the international network. So that's, I think, two really fine examples of what we mean by global Asia. On the second point about theorization and identity, I think it's the changing nature or fundamentals of the modern nation state. A lot of this is based on European conceptions, and in particular, the separation of church and state, which is a very modern idea, but also one in which the modern nation state was founded. And there's always been pushback on that, but pushback historically, but recently, or in the last decade or so, it's becoming increasingly a difficult dam on which to kind of to separate the two, right? Someone mentioned earlier, Modi's India. You can see developments in Thailand, developments in Malaysia, Indonesia, the church in the Philippines. Singapore's trying, of course, its hardest. And so you're starting to see this, I think, seepage. And it gets to a point where is this becoming exceptional, or it's becoming quite widespread throughout Asia, and maybe reconfiguring the role of religion, not just in public life, but almost at the constitutional level, right? At a really state-based level. But that said, neither do I think this is particularly Asian. You look at where I'm from, the United States, and there's a lot of Americans who believe in the Christian basis of the American state. So you see it on the rise in Asia, but neither would I call this particularly Asian. So yeah, it's a little this and a little that.
Thank you. Naoko?
Yeah, so I actually sort of have a problem in terms of try to understand what global Asia means. I mean, as a global historian of Asia, this might seem like a very strange thing to say, but I do sense this kind of tension between what we think is kind of what it means to have theorizations coming out of Asia. Does it mean that like Asian scholars doing this, or does it mean scholars based on Asia doing this, or does it mean like the empirical data based in Asia, on Asia, from which theories derive? Because if you think about many of the major theorists, right, in the recent past, I mean, that we all know, like James Scott, Ben Anderson, Homi Bhabha, even Edward Said, they're all basing their experiences or empirics on Asian experiences. So Asia has always been there in terms of kind of theories. Like, these are very grand, powerful theories. So what do we really mean? And I think if we are talking about kind of theoreticians coming out of Asia, i.e. people like us based here in ARI doing this thing. Is that what we want? Or what is it that we really are thinking about? And this is something that's really kind of puzzled me for a long time. So I just wanted to bring it out and share. I'd love to hear what you think about this. You've got any views on this kind of thing?
Thank you, Naoko. Greg?
We also don't want to lose the sense of diversity of Asia. And it's a big place. And I mean, some of my friends in Japan tease me that we use the term Asia more often in Singapore than in any other place in Asia. Asia is very real here because we're in the center of a lot of places. When I go to Japan, I hear the word Asia means somewhere else. In India, it doesn't mean East Asia, it means that part of the world. So I think also, even though we are a place where we're theorizing Asia, a lot of us are doing empirical work in particular parts. And that's just as valuable. That's my only point.
So Greg, since you have the floor, why don't you address that last question? And I think I'll end with this question about the STS cluster going beyond hard science and technology, but to explore the other way around, social science and humanities, using technology to explain social science and humanities roles in society, and also address 𝗔𝗕𝗧𝗧's question as to whether ARI is also collaborating with the sciences beyond the humanities and social sciences. Are there interactions with the science part of campus here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've just put together a big grant application with somebody from the Department of Biological Sciences, so and also with a zoologist. So we definitely are. In fact, every single large grant application we've done has involved at least one or more scientists. And I also just mentioned in my presentation that scientists are approaching us, also get involved in their projects. I think that I've increasingly learned over time that the supposed boundary between the humanities and social sciences and the hard sciences is really fluid. And I think that a lot of my colleagues in the humanities and social sciences don't realize how excited scientists are to work with us and how oftentimes they raise questions which are humanities questions and which they would like us to get involved in answering. I mean, I just came off of a conference in Fukushima, in which I was the only humanities scholar there. Everybody else was a medical doctor or radiation researcher, but they were all actually, many of them were doing social science, but they didn't call it social science. They called it science. Or in my presence or in the presence of others, social scientists, they tend to raise new questions that come from their research, but in which they don't publish about. So I think the opportunities for such cross-fertilization are huge. And particularly now that, as I said, we're in a crisis situation, going to everything from COVID to biodiversity to climate change. There's the opportunities within a lot of our clusters to talk with people, and not just the sciences, by the way. I mean, I'm about to step down as a cluster leader, and my replacement, 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧, is from the architecture department, which is now merging with engineering. So, which is another cross-fertilization which he's going to bring here. But the folks in architecture, the folks in engineering also are very amenable, I've found, to engaging with us.
Yeah. Tim, and then Naoko. Final points. Tim, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'm partly just echoing the kind of things that Greg's been saying here, and I think I flagged them in the excruciating video that I had to watch at the beginning. And that is to say, I think that there's real value for ARI in deep interdisciplinarity. So I don't mean merely collaborating amongst disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, but rather us as humanities and social science scholars collaborating with people in the sciences, in medicine, in law, in architecture and engineering, the way that Greg's just described. And of course, environment and climate are perhaps the most obvious examples there. Some of the projects that Greg's already mentioned in the STS cluster have already done this. Naoko's talked about others in the inter-Asia engagements cluster. So I think that ARI, humanities and social science scholars in general, have really important roles to play in those larger, deep interdisciplinary projects. And I also think we have something specific to offer. And that is especially in relation to environment. And I think that is the governance dimension. And I think this is one of the things that scientists and others really value in humanities and social sciences. We're not just talking about government and policy, but because we have deep historical understanding, we have contextual knowledge of how societies and cultures work, these are really important matters for long-term governance issues that have lasting impacts in the ways that policies can just shift like that. So I think that's a really important point.
Naoko?
Yeah, I entirely agree with what Tim said, and also just going back right to the beginning when Jamie said, talked about the importance of identities and what kind of areas that ARI should look into in future. I really think that we have to rethink about this idea of political culture, because that's something that that hasn't really been dealt with in the recent past, I think, in ARI. And maybe this is more your identities cluster kind of topic, but I do think that, you know, governmentality, governance, those kind of ideas are really, you know, underpinned by understanding of political culture and how politics work and how power is seen. Because this may be where we talk a bit about this kind of particularities of the Asian experiences, because political cultures are, you know, they're not all the same. And I do think that politics is something that that we might want to think more about, particularly if ARI is going to be, you know, promoting increased collaboration with sciences, because that's what they probably want to pick our brains for. But one thing I would say is that I think all this sort of scientists, engineers reaching out to humanities and social sciences is wonderful. But I don't think, I don't want us to be service sector for them, because I think we actually have our own right to be here. And, you know, what we do is very important. And I don't think we should just be kind of drawn into project just as a token historian, a token social scientist, so that, you know, their project becomes somehow more social science or humanities based, because I don't think one person or two is going to change the way fundamentally they think. It would be just picking our brains to do their work in the way that they would want to do. Because I do think that fundamentally humanities and social sciences is just so important to any society that we just have to keep it going and strengthen what we do, and also to reach out to different disciplines and sectors, but with our identity intact, I think.
Thank you, Naoko. There was a question about hiring plans for the clusters. So I guess the answer to that would be to look out to the ARI website to look for opportunities, and I'm sure the clusters are always looking for wonderful people, so do look out for these opportunities. And on that note, I'm going to end the discussion and hand over to Director Tim Bunnell for his concluding remarks. Tim?
Okay, thank you, Tai Yong. On the one hand, I feel like we just gave you momentum, but don't worry, I'm not going to turn back to discussion. It's 9:30 here in Singapore, and I realise it's getting late, and not least for the admin staff. I won't go over my 2 minutes, but largely I'll just use them to say thanks to various people, because that's really important. So I mentioned them already. ARI's events team, wonderfully dependable. And any of the technical issues that arose today are not their fault. They're mostly mine, I think. So thank you to them, as always. Naoko 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧, thank you, because Naoko was the person who's led this roundtable series. And I can tell you, in the face of COVID-19 disruptions, there's been lots of organization and reorganization. And so I'm very grateful to you, Naoko, for that too. This evening, thanks, Maitri, for chairing, fellow cluster leaders for your presentations, and of course, Tai Yong, thank you for leading the discussion. I'm also very grateful to everybody who's tuned in, and I note with particular thanks that includes several members of ARI's International Advisory Board, this is really seriously one of the upsides of being forced into virtual mode during the anniversary year, you know, having this kind of, maybe we call it global Asia, I don't know, tempting fate, but also involving all these wonderful associates and alumni of ARI that Brenda gestured to earlier as well. The idea of ARI20, just to remind everyone one last time, was not so much to showcase what ARI's already done, but rather to help us to focus attention and energy for the Institute's third decade, which we've now entered. I really look forward to working with many of you in different ways during that third decade, maybe even beyond, in helping to sustain ARI as a major intellectual asset for NUS, for Singapore, and for the region, a region where critical humanities and social sciences perspectives and the deep contextual knowledge that it generates and that we value remains, I think, as important as ever. So thank you, everyone. And on that note, I'll say good night to all of you. Thanks.